Hello, hello. Could someone in chat confirm that you can hear me? Okay, never mind. And now I have this on my phone, so I can hear myself. Okay, so we're all good. If you want to follow along, I have a link to the slideshow here in the chat, but that won't be necessary because I'll be talking and showing it on screen anyways. Um, okay, so around 10 o'clock, I thought, oh, I could sneak a quick little nap in. But instead of setting my alarm until 10:30, I set it to 9:30. So I woke up at 10:54. Not really ready. I mean, I'm ready to like all the slideshow stuff is ready, but I'm still kind of sleepy. So yeah. All right. So today's lecture is about some of the way that art can be categorized. Um, I think it's important to recognize that there's many directions I could take this class as far as what I'm going to teach, but I think learning how to categorize art, like how we do categorize it, um, is a really important step to understanding, uh, like why we have why these categories are necessary, why humans need them, what's the purpose of them, how do they help, and why they're not just like arbitrary labels. And they're actually very important. So let's get on with it. And by the way, I have my phone next to me in right here, so feel free to chime in with anything in chat. If you have any questions or anything, I'll try my best to answer them. Okay. So first of all, just like I mentioned last time, like I'm not going to talk about all the arts in general, like no performance art or literary arts. So we're talking primarily about visual arts, which are obviously based on the name, primarily visual, things that you see with your eyes. Of course, this can include music in it if you have um, like a video piece that inherently has sound within it, or sometimes when you have an exhibit that has music playing in the background, that can count as it. But again, we're talking about primarily visual art. Okay, so we won't be talking about poetry or theater, whatever. Um, so that's like a big, broad category. And I'm going to get. It's kind of it's kind of hard to say a one size fits all, but I'm zooming in a little bit more for each category, but not really. Um, but that was the most broad I can get here. Okay, so what's the purpose of categorizing art? So humans can only memorize so many things within our limited capabilities. Um, so we only have, I don't know the exact number, but once something we need to remember gets past a certain point, we're incapable of keeping all of those in our mind. So with the invention of writing, after that, um, when we learn how to categorize things and store them in sort of archives of sorts, we're able to keep more track of things. And I learned that from this book called Sapiens, which I should probably link. I forgot to link that. But yeah, it's important to just not have these works of art just floating around randomly. We need to be able to identify them. Otherwise, this class wouldn't exist. Otherwise, I would just be pointing at random things. But since we know how to categorize things, to name them, to put them into certain genres, etc. It's easy to keep track of, and rather possible to keep track of things. Okay, so titles is probably one of the most obvious ways we can keep track of artworks. And this is the name of the artwork, of course. And titles are interesting because they can mean a lot to the artwork or they can mean absolutely nothing. But either way, it has an effect on your work. So this one to the right, Nude Descending a Staircase by Marcel Duchamp, for example, it would I would argue it would be an abstraction if you didn't have the information necessary. You could probably gather that there is some kind of movement going on, but with the title Nude Descending a Staircase, that helps you understand, like, okay, these shapes are taking form as far as um, probably a person, probably a woman, because nudes are usually women, because straight white men, kind of rule the world when it comes to these things. So this, and then there's this downward motion, like this, and that correlates with the descending down the staircase. So, this name is telling us what probably might be going on, what the author's intentions are possibly. But also, there's titles that don't mean anything necessarily. For example, Untitled, which is an interesting thing in itself. But with Untitled things, I personally use Untitled as a title because I feel that giving like is one of those things where I feel that the artwork should speak for itself, where adding in another layer of language might provide too much information when I really just want you to sort of come to your own conclusion. And this is a reason I might use it. The reason other people might use it could be different. It could be the same. Or maybe you just don't like coming up with titles and you're really bad at them. Or maybe you've been panned for giving a bad, misleading title or something like that. So the titles have a huge amount of power, more than you would think. So it's also could be used as a form of, this is a hard word to pronounce, mnemonic. I think that's how you say it. Where it's essentially a way to get you to memorize like an easier way to remember what this artwork is. One of my favorite names, so there's this band called Minus the Bear, where they have just a bunch of really weird titles for their songs that have nothing to do with the actual lyrics. Like, hey, is that a ninja up there? Or monkey, knife, fight. And I'm totally not down with Rob's Alien, but they have nothing to do with it. But I remember those titles for these particular pieces because they're so funny and outrageous. And it just makes it more fun. And a lot of bands in the math rock genre there's a lot of instrumental titles or a lot of instrumental songs, and they use a lot of silly titles, just, I guess, as an easier way to remember them. So I don't see that often when it comes to visual arts as much, which is kind of unfortunate. But yeah, you'll get stuff like Water Lilies, number 65, for example, and there'll be a painting of water lilies. And in that sense, they're just purely descriptive. So titles have a broad range of uses that you probably know about, and it makes sense, but maybe you didn't think about as having so many different uses. Artist is another easy one that most people know about. The bottom is David Lynch. He does a lot of different kinds of art. I don't know the title of this. I forgot to get that. But it's like a mixed media painting. And he also made Eraserhead, which is a really, really bizarre movie. If you're a fan of Twin Peaks, then I would recommend seeing Eraserhead. And he also makes some weird electronic music as well, which isn't known as much. But yeah, so grouping art by artist is a really good way, as because we think of artists in the Western tradition, um, contemporarily. We think of artists as their own individual entities. Whereas once upon a time, and well, I mean, even sometimes now, um, the individual artist's name wasn't important. It was the society helped build this thing, or it was workers who made these pots or whatever, where the individual wasn't as important. So, artist is not the most foolproof uh, way to categorize art as you might think. I mean, it pretty much almost is now, because that's just kind of the expectation for the artist to be recognized, because we're a very, very individualist society. But yeah, again, um, it's not always so foolproof, especially, but it's important because that's how we usually group artists now. We think of artists as these individuals, but of course, as David Lynch proves here, we could do a lot of different types of art. So the artist for all three of these is David Lynch. I mean, for this film, Eraserhead, he is the director and a few other things. Like, he wasn't the sole artist, but all three of these have this name David Lynch in common, despite being so different from each other. So that's a really useful way to lump things together. Media. So one thing that I do want to clear up, semantics wise, language wise, in other words, is that media is the plural form of the word medium. Okay, so media is a plural word. That's easily mistaken quite a bit, and even I do it sometimes still. All right, so a medium is the way we use to communicate something. Just it's because we have these thoughts or visions in our heads, or these ideas we want to get out, and you can't directly understand them just as they are. Um, so speech is medium, for example, because it's a way of us to communicate our thoughts to other people. Its speech isn't pure because, like, for example, I just woke up and so my thoughts are clouded right now. So I make might be like making mistakes with how I um, talk about things. That proves that speech isn't infallible. That there's mistakes when people have misunderstandings. That's because there's a medium that's communicating thoughts from one person to another. And so, like painting, drawing, those are different media, and those communicate different things. And with media, what you choose is depending on it's kind of hard to say, but what you choose. Some media are better at communicating your thoughts than others. For example, if I wanted to, like right now, for example, I am communicating what I look like with this webcam. I'm not telling you with words, or I don't have a drawing on screen to tell you what I look like. You can see a little. Let's see if I can point to myself. I don't know how to do it. Yeah. um, See, I'm pointing to myself. Like, I'm using this webcam as a way to show you what I look like. And I decided to use a webcam instead of using an animation done in real time, which would be impossible, right? To communicate what I look like right now. And a reason I have a live cam of myself instead of just having this on screen is because I feel like the nonverbal gestures that I use, like my facial expressions, maybe my hand gestures, or whatever, might help communicate what I'm trying to say better. Okay, so that's why I choose to use this visual medium of webcam. Um, but yeah, so some people use paintings to talk about things. Some people use poetry. And sometimes these things are mixed together, and this is called mixed media. But yeah, let's look at a few examples. So drawing's one of the easiest example to talk about, but it's actually pretty complex. So drawing, as the slide says, it's both a medium and an action, because a drawing is something that you can have, like these two examples, but it's also when you're drawing something, you're drawing, right? You can also call it sketching or whatever, but drawing, we use that word quite a bit. And the same thing with other media. So it's interesting because it's really hard to define. A lot of people, or I should say, the way I've been taught is that it's the act of making marks on paper or whatever, but that's not necessarily true. Sorry for those who like everything with neat definitions, but drawing does not qualify for this because you could draw with a paintbrush, and we'll get a little bit more into that later. And so drawing doesn't have a singular, easy definition. Fortunately, unfortunately, I don't know. So what I have right here is Adana Kare. I don't know how to pronounce her name. She makes these gigantic drawings with pencil. So we think of drawings quite often with pencil on paper, and that's what this is. And she turns into something huge, gigantic, and completely impressive. And here on the right is a digital drawing, where you use a tablet or mouse even, but probably a tablet, a digital tablet, to draw shapes on the computer, mostly based on lines. And is what's interesting about digital art is that when it comes to drawing and painting, it's hard to tell the difference. I don't know. So I would say this is probably a drawing because there's really strong lines. Um, but at the same time, there are no like contour lines here. It's just shading. And I would consider this more drawing than painting because it's an illustration. But the thing is, like this green is kind of filled in. So is that kind of so now you can see all these sorts of problems with trying to define what a drawing is because I don't really know. It's kind of impossible to tell exactly what a drawing is and the difference between that and the painting. Okay, so a a fake definition for painting is it usually involves paint, usually, um, and paint is made from a pigment combined with other materials like adhesives or binders and medias. That's another kind of medium. Um, but yeah, it's usually like physical materials mixed together, and they're usually spread across a flat surface instead of based on lines. But again, like not always, you know. So on this example, which is a digital painting, uh, there is some strong line work here, right? It's a little bit blurry, but it does have some contour lines, which we'll talk about next week, I guess. Whereas this one, it's a softer painting where there's no dark strokes to make it really look like a drawing. So see what I'm getting at with it's being harder to find what's what. And also this is a digital painting, so there's no actual pigment used, but it looks more like a painting than a drawing to me. So again, the drawings looks more flat, I guess. And then this one has like the usual like brush strokes here, for example, that would indicate that this is a painting. And again, with digital works, it makes it a really blurry gray area type of thing where I don't know. Um, it's sort of one of those things where you kind of know it when you see it, but at the same time, is it really that? Who knows? And then here's an example of a drawing and a painting. So I would consider these the background of this to be more of a painting because it has this more painterly look. There's some contour lines. Contour lines meaning basically mean like the outline to define shapes. So it's like pretty painting like. But then we have this character Brock, the investigator, which is yeah, here's a link here, which is it's a video game. So like you see in a lot of old Looney Tunes, or I guess most cartoons, where they have this static background, a matte painting or whatever, and then you can clearly see the characters being drawn and animated, very very clear. You know what's gonna move in the painting and what's not. That's what's going on here, and so I think that's like a really easy example of how drawing and painting are combined. Um, so, so my question to you is, let's say if you had to pick either a drawing or a painting, and you can speak up in chat, by the way, would you consider this more of a drawing or more of a painting if you had to make one of them? So, I'll give my rationale for both. So as far as a painting, I would say if we were to consider this a painting, then that would mean like flattening the Brock, this handsome boy. He's such a cute character. I love him. Um, we would, yeah. I don't know. I don't think I could consider it just a drawing or just a painting. I have to argue it's both, no matter what. Honestly, I don't know. Um, yeah. Although it so I got this comment last year when I taught this, like Daniel doesn't know what he's talking about. But I think it's really important to be okay with not knowing everything. Okay, so Rachel says it looks like a drawing that was painted after almost. Um, yeah, I could see that. Um, yeah, well, I would say the painting comes first. Okay, I think I see what you're saying. Where like the drawing of the shapes and stuff that came first, and then it was painted in. Maybe um, that's possible. Again, I guess it's not necessarily to just go on about this. The point is that media are not as easily defined as you would think so. Okay, photography. Um, photography is an interesting media or medium. Sorry, see, I messed that up. It's about recording light through photosensitive material. So that would be film if we were talking about analog cameras or a sensor in the back of a digital camera, including your phones. Okay, so photography is interesting because people often think of it as the truth, like you need that as proof for something. And obviously, it's not always the case. So, this is a photograph by my friend Jonathan Edward Bagby, who likes to photograph things that kind of are on the bounds of like what's real, what's not. So he has this photograph of these these brushes up against a painting or a mural with these brushes, right? And it's pretty funny, right? Because we see the real and the represented thing, but we're also looking at a photo where it's just a photo. It's not the actual plants themselves, right? So there's a few layers of what's real and what's not. And then we have this example of a obviously digitally manipulated photograph, because I'm hard pressed to find these pixels perfectly aligned to your vision in real life. I've never seen that. So a lot of humans think of what are called straight photographs, not as opposed to gay, um, straight as opposed to manipulated. I never take any straight photographs in that other sense. So yeah, it's funny because people think of these as the truth, and I would say most of the time they do the job, and that's good enough, and that's fine. But remember, when you're taking a photograph of something, even if you don't change any of the settings or apply any filters, you're choosing one slice out of the world. You could have backed up like 5 more inches and have a different photograph. You could have zoomed in more and have a different photograph. So photography is a lot about what you keep in from the world and and you're excluding the rest of the world from it. I could talk about photography a long time. That was my undergrad major. But according to Wikipedia, and this is a link that you can follow through on, here's a bunch of different uh, media, which I'm obviously not going to go all over because I don't know all of them. Okay. This I forgot about that. Oh my god. Okay, so a lot of the example artworks that you're getting um, are are taken from yesterday and the day before. The examples, I update this every year. Um, and that's from a game that was released a couple of days ago. Late night thoughts, exactly. It's also why you see so many furry images, is because I subscribe to a lot of furry artists, and you're gonna get a lot of them. Um, so whatever. So here's a pretty obvious example. I keep on saying that, but again, it is obvious. So all these were made. All these were posted on April 2nd and April 3rd. April 2nd or April 3rd. Like these top two, or this one were April 2nd. This was April 3rd. I just couldn't not include this. Um, and of course, yeah, year is important because we know time is important, even though time is a human construct, blah, blah, blah. It's still a good way to indicate when something was made. It gives us the context of um, what was happening around that time, right? So if for example, if this was created in 1993, we would look at this a lot differently. We would think, oh, it was probably for the original Nintendo, right? Because it has these old school graphics, so to speak. But since it was made in 2021, we think, like, we're more apt to think, oh, it just has this retro aesthetic. It's taking from the language of beforehand. Whereas this on the left, um, which was posted April 2nd, it could have been any time where pigment was created, or after painting was invented. Uh, Probably afterwards, when painting was. The reason I say there's a certain point where painting developed, because the first known paintings or whatever were on the caves of Lascaux in France, where people took pigment. They held their hands up to a cave wall and blew the pigment, and it created an outline. They wouldn't have been able to make this by mixing pigments and stuff. So yeah, this could have been made at any time. This could have been made earlier, but however, I know it's not, because it's based on this game called Rivals of Ether, and this is probably a digital drawing. Um, so it's since probably could have done since 1990. Um, mm, I might be totally wrong when it comes to digital drawing thing. Um, I don't know. I know there's digital drawings done before that, but it's hard to explain my rationale. Um, but anyways, yeah, like so yeah, year provides context. Like when things were made in the year 2020, we all know what happened in 2020. There is so much stuff. Um, I've been bumping this album um, called "Loud Enough Now" by this band called, which is literally just. I'm gonna put it in chat. It's just three exclamation points. I can't say the actual lyrics, but it's talking trash about George Bush, and saying how the president can do some bad things. Let's just say that. And it's funny listening to that again because it was made in 2004, I believe, and listening to that just puts me in this really different mode of, oh my gosh, this was so long ago. Um, we had a terrible president back then, but like this the singer didn't had no idea what was to come when it came to Trump. So it's funny knowing that context. Um, it looks like I'm talking a lot and I need to go faster. Sorry, we're halfway through. So dimensions. When it is this one is I'm talking about size. So when you see something like this, 10 meters by 20 meters by 13 meters, it's always height by width if it's 2D, but if it's depth, that's a third number. So this is the height, this is the width, and this is the depth. I don't know why those words are so hard to say, but they are. So this is a giant bean in Chicago, which is weird. It's not in Beantown, Boston. It's in Chicago. Whatever. I haven't seen it. And then there's also dimension, which is a totally different thing. So two-dimensional art is art that exists on a flat plane. And then there's this technicality where if there's texture, it can make it 3D. But that's just more of that like technicality edge case stuff. So three-dimensional art is art that primarily uses three-dimensional volumes, like sculpture, for example. That's the most prominent one. And four-dimensional art is time. So technically, this isn't the fourth dimension when it comes to physics, but within the realm of art, that's what the fourth dimension is, time. And it's funny because when it comes to time and the fourth dimension in art, it doesn't have to be 3D. It doesn't have to be a 3D sculpture. Video, for example, is considered 4D, even though it doesn't have that dimension of three dimensionality. So it's, I don't know. It's kind of a silly naming convention, but it works until you actually think about it. So it's best to just think about it at shorthand. So here's an example by one artist, Jack Sachs, who's also like a really good marathon runner. Fun fact about him. So this is 2D art where everything is on a flat plane. There are suggestions of depth because there's shadows here. So things go in and out of each other, but we can tell that this is 2D as opposed to this 3D thing. So what's interesting about this 3D thing is that it looks like it could be real, like it could exist in the universe. Like maybe Jack Sachs did make a 3D print of this or sculpt it or whatever. But as far as I know, he doesn't do that with most of his work. He does with some of it. But this was rendered in a computer with a 3D modeling program. And we still call it 3D even though we only see a flat image on the screen, and we'll only see this as a flat image. So it's technically only 2D. But again, calling it 3D is shorthand for, okay, we understand that this artist is working within a three-dimensional program. Okay, and Here's 4D art where it moves. So this conveniently is has the third dimension of it being 3D within the screen. Because we know that I should say I know that because there's shadows everywhere, there's depth. This character is moving across a plane. Really, it's just pixels changing their position on our screen space. Um, and so again, it's technically 2D, but 4D is just our way of understanding how that this is time. So yeah, again, the language for this is imperfect. By the way, I minored in human communication, so I might be going off the deep end here. But human, yeah, the way we talk to each other is kind of imperfect, and we're trying to share our thoughts with each other. I just need to move on. Okay, so I get too excited about things. So collection is basically when wealthy white people own a bunch of artworks, um, and they're categorized by such. And this is actually a more common thing than you would think, because there's a lot of exhibits that happen because these wealthy white. I mean, sometimes they're people of color, but let's be honest, most of the time, no. So these wealthy white collectors have a bunch of artwork because it makes them look very civilized and have a lot of good reputation for being so cultured or whatever, just typical wealthy white people stuff. And so they lend their collections to galleries. For example, in my mom's work, Fullerton College, which was where I went to school. Oh, I forgot the name. But there's this family that loaned their collection of artworks that had pretty big names there, and it came from their personal collection that they own. And no way any of us normies could afford it, right? But it was really cool to see all these like really impressive artworks. So but there's also like collections by the museum itself. Like a museum will own a bunch of artworks. Like, for example, they'll have an exhibit on our collection of clay pots by uh, people from China from the 50s or whatever. Like some really specific thing. And yeah, like I think it's a pretty cool way for people to own art and to show what they have, I guess. But it also does remind me that capitalism is ultimately what matters when it comes to art, like everything. So this is a short little documentary about Urban Dorothy Vogel. They're an exception to the rule, but you can see the joy in the artwork that they collect. Yeah, they're rich and they're white, um, but the way they talk about artwork is so inspiring and it's so awesome. Um, as you can tell, I'm kind of very cynical about collectors because a bunch of them will buy artworks and then trade them up for more value. So it's more about money and cultural importance and impressing people than it is about actually enjoying the artwork. But sometimes there's people like this who really, really do love art. So yeah, exhibitions is so there's some exhibitions where some artworks only exist in that exhibition. This is an example right here called the ZM Garden, which yours truly actually has a piece in or two pieces in, but I don't show it here because I didn't take a screenshot. Whoops. But yeah, so these pieces, this is a digital exhibition where these pieces only, well, they probably exist on people's computers as well. I take that back. They don't only exist on in this uh, exhibition. I have my own copies on my computer, and they're separate from everything else. But yeah, this is a collection of digital artworks by a bunch of different people. And this, for example, is like you're the user picking this up. And yeah, sometimes art's categorized by what exhibition they're in. And a lot of these artworks within this exhibition, the ZM Garden, are known because they were in the ZM Garden, right? Where they might not be shown anywhere else. Yeah, this says they're often grouped by theme. There was no theme here. It was just, hey, everyone, just submit something and I'll choose whatever is cool. And yeah, but usually there is a very strong theme, like student artwork, for example. All right, let me take a drink of water real quick. All right. Okay, so genre. All right, so genre is an interesting thing because it also is something that's not has clear boundaries. So genres are completely imaginary things, whereas, for example, the year, dimensions, media, even though those might be a little bit blurry, well, year's not that blurry. There's exceptions to that. Things were made over multiple years. But these things are more objective markers of what things are. Whereas genres are more subjective, where a culture or a group of people decide that these artworks are grouped together based on this idea. Whether that's like, I'll talk about different genres, but it could be, there's many different types of genres. Like when it comes to movies, there's horror, romantic comedies, or whatever. But there's also horror romantic comedies. Like, I forgot what it's called, but like a zombie who is dating a human that came out like probably 5-10 years ago or something like that. And they're in an airport or something. Anyways, Warm Bodies. Yeah, Warm Bodies. Like that was horror and romantic comedy and stuff. Shaun of the Dead's a good example. Where these things like for example, Halloween is definitely like just a horror. And we know that as a horror movie. And what makes it a horror movie? And we also know Cabin in the Woods is a horror movie. But that's a lot different than Halloween. And Poltergeist is another horror. And so we have these different subgenres like supernatural horror, slasher horror, whatever. So things become very muddled and weird. But they're just ways for us to sort of understand in general, like, okay, this movie probably has these elements in them more or less. Okay, and I guess I'll teach this word. It's one of my favorite words. Locator, Locator. It has a similar purpose as a definition. Where a definition, you're trying to define something specifically. A locator is saying it's something kind of like this, not necessarily perfectly fitting within it, but this is a good enough definition. So genre is a locator. Oh, that's a fun word to use. So landscape and portraiture are part of the hierarchy of genres. So within this like specific context of gosh, don't quote me, like I think 18th century European art, 17th century European art, could be more than that. I took a class in that where there like different genres of art such as portraiture, landscape, a couple history paintings. Like history paintings were the most important genres, and like landscape paintings were like the least important genres. Like those used to be like literally ranked what's like better. But these are two important ones, and the reason I specifically used landscape and portraiture for this first slide is because they have a well-established history of being genres, with landscape being a representation of an actual landscape without sometimes having people, but mostly focus on the landscape itself. I also want to point out that this is where the landscape orientation of like printing paper, for example, comes from, where it's wider than it is taller. And portraiture is the opposite when it comes to orientation, where it's taller than it is wider. And portraiture is another example of a very well documented genre of art. This is Self Portrait in a Velvet Dress by Frida Kahlo, who we may or may not be talking about later. Oh, actually, it completely depends on this class who you want to talk about. Um, I'll explain that later in a different week. Um, Character concept art. So, um, um, these handsome little fellows. So, something that's not really talked about in fine art circles are like illustration. But character and concept art are essentially like characters that could be in a larger overall story or movie or video game or any other piece of media, or they might just stand alone. That would be more of the concept art, where it's something that you're making to maybe fit into a universe that exists, or maybe just alone. If this is the final piece, it could just be called character art, where it just focuses on the character. It doesn't focus on them in like relaxing on a hammock, for example. It's just this character in a very minimal setting. The reason a person would have, like, for example, these reflections instead of just a blank background is to give it a sense of a space. It's not just floating. It's more comfortable to see something on a flat surface. Ooh, I need to go a lot faster than this. Video games are a good example, because there are a lot of genres in one. So not only is this a video game, but there's also environmental design. So which also includes lighting and texturing. So by putting lights places, by texturing these instead of just having these blank boxes, like you're creating a scene that's kind of an artwork, and that creates an environmental design, right? Or environmental design is the umbrella term for all the little details. Okay, and here's another list of genres. You could get as granular as you want with this. Movement style. So this is very much tied to culture, and it's usually within a certain time period. So, but not always. So Impressionism is the easiest example. So we know of these like very romantic, soft, usually landscape, bright, colorful paintings. Impressionism as done by the Europeans like hundreds of years ago, right? But people still do it today, of course. But we think of it as coming from this movement, where during this time period in the 1800s, if I'm getting that right, I'm terrible with dates, which is why I'm not an art historian, and I'll never be one. So it's usually like a group of people who get together, who have this idea of what art should be, or what art could be, or they're forming a bond over shared interest in making stuff, and sort of like bouncing off each other, and sort of converge their interests into making this kind of artwork that maybe no one has seen before. And so Impressionism had a huge boom. It was, even though it's very common today, it was extremely rebellious way to make paintings. Like, a lot of people at the time thought this was trash. The word Impressionism was an insult, actually. It was. There's this example of, I can't remember the artist or the name, but it's not Turner. It might be Turner. I don't remember. But it's basically like this. It's very blurry basically, and so on says like it's basically an unfinished painting. It's trash. What's it doing it in an exhibit? So impressionism is now canon. Like people accept it and love it because it's soft and easy on the eyes. But it was controversial back then. Here's a couple others that you probably won't learn about in art history class. I don't have any contemporary examples really. Um, so I'll go to these really old examples. So Rococo, which was 17th century, I believe. Which it's just this really fancy ornamental style that was opposed to like very hard geometry. It's extremely like flowery and romantic and over the top. Um, I didn't think like you can see in this style, there's just so much going on here, and it's so extravagant and it's ridiculous and it's kind of funny. Um, yeah, you probably won't learn about that, but it's just like one of these genres that's just why like it's just too much. It's just like eating way too much candy, but at the same time, it's enjoyable. It's like mostly about pure joy, expression of joy and love and stuff. So it's cool and uh, I guess. And then op art, optical illusions, basically, which happened in the '60s to '70s. That was a big movement where people did like basically trippy stuff. I mean, it was the '60s. Come on. And here's a video about surrealism. It's gonna yeah. There's a quiz for people in this class, but yeah, it's a really good video. Again, it's by the art assignment, which I'll show a bunch of videos from. Here's a list of movements and purposes of art. So, purpose of art is a it's a very contentious thing because we have the artist's intent versus what does the viewer think about this, and what do art historians think about this versus what do curators think about this. So what is the purpose of an artwork? It depends from person to person, based on the artist, based on art historians, based on curators, based on individuals, so it's again, this is very messy. Even though at the beginning a lot of them, I would say year is the most objective marker of where you can define something in art, but everything else is kind of has gray areas. But yeah, so there's different purposes for different arts. Like for example, communication. Um, we're going to talk about the Bayeux Tapestry, which was a series of images that communicated what the society did, like how a war went, for example, or communicate like you make a drawing to this cute boy that you have a crush on that communicates your feelings towards him. Those communicate things, but also everything kind of communicates things to each other. But sometimes communication is a primary aspect of something. Aesthetic, just making something pretty. You want to talk about your culture group, because you have to. This has to do with school and like having to do assignments and stuff, which I'm forcing y'all to do. Sometimes you may enjoy it, sometimes you don't, but sometimes that's the purpose of the artwork because you have to for a grade. Um, so there's some this I can't get over the these earpieces for the wolf. I love it so much. But on the left, there's this game called Cruel World, which I participate in, which is basically there's limited copies. Only you can only buy it on April 1st, and the save points you have to like hack into it, and if you hack into it, it makes it harder for other people to hack into it, and it makes it worse for everyone. And it talks about the scarcity, like how digital products shouldn't be scarce because there's a whole discussion about NFTs, which is like, actually, I'm not going to get into it because I'm going to go over time today. But yeah, this piece of this video game has a lot of meaning attached to it. There's some other purposes of art. So high art and low art. So high art. This is again an example of that's very subjective. I'm sorry, I forgot to put an artwork here to look at. You can look at my pretty face instead. So higher is basically what's considered to be stuff that only rich people could afford, and lower is stuff that lower class people can afford. Basically, what it is. You'll see like maybe museums and art historians telling you otherwise, but that's honestly what it comes down to. So higher in the music world would be considered physically going to the opera, right? Whereas low art would be considered listening to anything on the radio, because higher again is only accessible to people who have money, and higher is often said to have more meaning and intention and work behind it, which is complete garbage. It's an extremely classist way to classify art. And stuff like comics, video games, some forms of music, definitely anything made by people of color would be considered low art, because racism is hand in hand with classism. That's how it is. Um, so yeah, okay. I said we're gonna discuss this another week. So I will. I'm never not. I'm never gonna get off my soapbox, but I'm gonna talk more about this later. But yeah, that's another way artwork is unfairly categorized. And art versus craft. So instead of talking about, I'm just gonna have you watch this video. It's a very interesting way to think about things. When I was talking about your relationship to art, that was a question for my students. Um, I think one or two of them said they're doing stuff that's more considered craft. It's still art, but it depends on your perspective and what culture you're from. And this will give a really good idea um, of the difference between them and why we separate them, and how at some point they weren't separated. It's a very blurry thing, but people think about art and craft nowadays as art doesn't have a purpose and craft does. If you have to have a shorthand, sure, that's acceptable. Um, but at the same time, like calling pottery or stained glass craft, which is pretty common, I don't, I don't, I don't know. I don't agree with that necessarily. Like I took a stained glass class. If you ever take a stained glass class, I do recommend it, but your fingers will get tore up. Um, yeah, like it. I don't know. It's ridiculous. I try not to think about these things, but this is a good way to sort of put in perspective what art and craft is. Oh, okay, that's a lecture, and I didn't go over by too much. So thank you so much for watching. Um, yeah, if you're a student, then oh, I haven't posted the assignment yet. I still have to do that. I didn't post it because I was busy napping. Whoops. But yeah, that's it for categorizing art. I definitely want to make sure you know that these aren't all the ways you can categorize art. There's probably an infinite amount of ways you could do it. You can combine things together. Um, like for example, another, like if you want to be more specific, you could be like, this is feminist artwork. This is intersectional feminist artwork. This is uh, black feminist artwork. You could go infinite amounts of ways to categorize things, and that I'm just talking about like feminism, and you could talk about yeah. I was gonna say there's a genre for every artwork, every piece of artwork, possibly, but generally the way we categorize things are limited more towards what's practical. So, although I could have talked about thousands, probably more realistically, tens of ways more to categorize art, I stuck with what's generally more or less what you'll see, what you'll come across if you go to galleries and museums and stuff and go online. Um, so yeah, I'm really good at rambling, so I'm just gonna say again, thanks for stopping by. Love you. Toodles.